Hey everyone, I'm Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Today I'm going to show you how to check and adjust the valve clearance on your 2018 and newer CRF250R and RX. Checking your valve clearance should be a part of your routine maintenance, and this is just going to help prevent issues while you're out riding. Some of those issues could be a bike that is hard to start, or maybe it just has a poor idle. So the scheduled maintenance for the 2018 and newer CRF 250Rs and RXs is going to be after the initial break-in ride, and then every 15 hours of use thereafter. You can use an hour meter on these bikes to help keep track of that. Now we're going to show you how to do it on a 2019 CRF 250RX. To do this job, we have safety glasses and several different common hand tools, including a torque wrench, digital caliper, and some feeler gauges. Now for this bike, we are going to turn the gas tank upside down, so we have a vacuum cap to put on top of the tank, and we're also using some hose to install our new spark plug. And then I highly recommend having the bike-specific auto cam chain tensioner tool. That's going to help you out a lot, but you can do it without this tool, and we'll show you how. To start things off, we're going to remove our seat and the radiator shrouds. Underneath the left side of the gas tank, we have this plastic tie we need to undo. Next, we'll take off this rubber strap, and then we have a bolt in the front of the tank we'll remove. Then we can remove the vent tube and put our vacuum cap on top of our gas cap. And when we flip this gas tank over, it's going to keep any fuel from spilling out. Next, we're going to lift up on the gas tank and hang it off of the left side of the bike and just let it hang from that cable strap that's connected to the tank. Now to make sure we don't accidentally crank the engine over, we're going to disconnect our negative battery cable. The next things we need to do are remove this ignition coil. So we have two connectors, one on top, one on bottom, the two bolts. We've just got a swivel extension to help access these bolts. And then our spark plug cap, we'll pull up on that. Next, we're going to clean any dirt away from the valve cover and away from that spark plug hole using some compressed air. And now we'll remove the spark plug with a 14mm socket. And then we'll remove the breather hose. And then we'll remove the valve cover. Now on the left side of the engine on the stator cover, I'm going to remove the two timing covers. The next thing we need to do is put the engine at top dead center on the compression stroke. So to do that, we're going to align a mark that's in the flywheel up with an indexing mark on this flywheel cover. And we'll do that by turning the crankshaft counterclockwise until those two marks line up. So you'll notice we have a firing mark. Keep rotating past that, and then we have another mark with a T. Once that T mark is lined up, then we'll check the timing on the camshafts. Now up at the camshafts, there's two things we're looking for. There's two lines on each cam sprocket. Those lines need to be level with the cylinder head surface, which they are, but the weight on the exhaust camshaft is in the wrong spot. This weight needs to be on the bottom side, and that's going to be top dead center on the compression stroke. So we need to turn our crankshaft 360 degrees, and everything's going to be in the right spot. Now to measure the valve clearance, we're just going to take the measurement between the cam lobe and the rocker arm. Now all you want to do with these feeler gauges is find the biggest gauge that fits in between that clearance without forcing it in. There should be some slight drag on the gauge. Now the spec for the intake is 11/100ths of a millimeter, plus or minus 3/100ths. And then the spec for the exhaust valves is 19/100ths of a millimeter, plus or minus 3/100ths. So we'll go ahead and take those measurements and write them down. Now this is how I like to write everything out. I just have the same valve configuration as if the top of the page was the front of the bike. And the spec for the intake valves, again, it's 11/100ths of a millimeter plus or minus 0.03, and we are within spec. And then the exhaust, the spec is 19/100ths of a millimeter plus or minus 0.03. And again, we are in spec. So at this point, we could reinstall our valve cover and put everything back together. But if you happen to have one of these measurements or all of them that are out of spec, we're going to go ahead and show you how to take care of that. To get the valves adjusted up, we're going to have to remove both camshafts. And to do that, we're going to remove this upper cam chain guide. The next thing we need to do is remove all of the tension from our cam chain. The easiest way to do that is with an auto cam chain tensioner tool. Now for this specific bike, you're probably going to have to use the tool from Honda because one like this is going to hit on that exhaust. So we're going to show you how to do it without this tool. We're just going to loosen up this bolt in the back and then completely remove the tensioner. Now we can loosen up this cam sprocket bolt, and once you've done that, you can rotate the engine 360 degrees. So at this point, the weight on the exhaust camshaft should be facing up, and then you'll completely remove this exposed bolt on the intake cam sprocket. And again, be really careful not to drop this into the bottom end. With the bolt out, you'll rotate the crankshaft another 360 degrees to put it back at top dead center on the compression stroke. We're going to remove this second bolt for that intake camshaft sprocket. And then we're going to completely remove this sprocket. Next, we have all of these bolts on top of the cam cap, and we need to loosen them up in a crisscross pattern, and you want to take 2 or 3 steps to loosen these up all the way. The middle bolt with the 8mm head is a locating bolt. Now, as I remove these bolts, I'm just going to lay them out in order, and keep in mind 2 of these bolts, they have crush washers on them, and we're going to replace those on reassembly. Make sure the dowel pins stayed in place, and we also have this O-ring. Next, I'm going to take a little bit of safety wire. Make sure you don't drop this down into the bottom end. And we're just going to safety wire this chain up. That way it's going to be easy for us to grab later on. I'm just making a hook to hang on the side of that cylinder head once we get these camshafts out. So I'm going to start by removing the intake camshaft. We'll just pull the cam chain out of the way. All right, now obviously, if all you needed to do was adjust the intake valves, that's the only cam you would have to take out, and you can actually roll these rocker arms back, take the shim out, and make your adjustments. But if you need to do the exhaust, we'll go ahead and remove the exhaust cam. Then we'll hang that cam chain on the side, and now we can just flip all of these rockers all the way back. And using a clean magnet, I'm just going to take each of these shims out one at a time, place them in order, and that way we can get the correct ones back in the right spot. And one thing I do want to point out is as you go through the process, just check for any obvious signs of damage. So if the pads on these rockers, if they look really worn down, or if the camshaft looks damaged, then you want to make sure you get those parts replaced on reassembly. All right, so next we're going to measure all of the shims that we have and write those measurements down on our sheet. All right, so all of our clearances were actually within spec, but let's just say instead of a 0.13 on this intake valve that we had 0.05. If we had a 208 shim in there and that's our clearance, we can subtract this clearance from the spec, which is 0.11, and then you're just going to subtract 0.06 from 0.08. That's going to give you 2.02 shim. So that's the easy way to do it, but if you want to use the math formula, you can plug these numbers into the formula A equals B minus C plus D. So A is going to be your new shim thickness, B is the recorded valve clearance, C is your specified valve clearance, and D is the old shim thickness. So if we plug what our measurements into this formula, we're going to get A equals 0.05 minus 0.11 plus 2.08 millimeter, and then that's going to give us negative 0.06 millimeter plus 2.08 millimeter, and then we get the 2.02 millimeter. So with this measurement, the shims come in 0.025 millimeter increments or 0.05 millimeter increments, depending what kit you buy or if you buy them individually. So for this, we could either get this exact shim, or we could go all the way down to a 2.00 and all the way up to a 2.05, because the spec is 0.11 millimeter plus or minus 0.03 millimeters. So you can add or take away 0.03 millimeters from this to get the right shim. The next scenario you might run into is a zero clearance, and we're just going to use the same valve for an example. So we'll plug those numbers into the formula. So we have 0 minus 0.14 millimeters. The reason we're using 0.14 is we're taking the 0.11 spec that's right in the middle, and we're adding the 0.03 because we want to gain as much clearance as we can. And then we have that in parentheses plus 2.08 millimeters. So that's minus 0.14 plus 2.08. And our new shim size is going to be a 1.94 millimeter, or whatever's closest to that. And so we have a 1.95 millimeter shim, and this is going to do just fine. We'll put that in, check the clearance, see if we gained any clearance, and go from there. You might have to put another shim in again. Once you have the correct shim sizes, place them in order. We're also going to clean the threads on this camshaft and the threads on these cam sprocket bolts because we're using Loctite. And then you want to lube these cam lobes and the journals, and then we're also going to apply some lube to these shims when they go into place. Now we're also replacing these crush washers on the two bolts and this O-ring. To go back together, we have a shaft going through both of these rockers, and it actually has a cutout spot on it for a locating bolt. That way that's not spinning in there. And most of the time, this bolt is going to go right back into place. So if it drops almost all the way down to the threads on the bolt, then you're not going to have to do anything. But if it doesn't, you might have to take this bolt on the side off and then move this shaft around until this bolt goes in the correct spot. Then I'm going to rotate that shaft, and you can see with the shaft in the wrong spot, this bolt sits up really high. You can just rotate that shaft, and eventually you're going to see it drop down. Don't forget to clean the sealing surface, and then we're going to reinstall the crush washer, apply some Loctite to the bolt, and torque it to 13 foot-pounds. Now before we put any parts in here, I'm just going to wipe around this sealing surface since we have easy access to it. Next thing we'll do is install all of the shims. Next thing we're going to do is put the rocker arms back into place. And then we need to install the exhaust camshaft, but you want to verify your timing mark on that flywheel cover, make sure everything's still timed correctly, and then you'll be able to pull up on that wire on the cam chain And then you're going to set the exhaust cam into place. So what you can do is pull this cam chain all the way tight, as far as it can go, and then you're going to line up your timing marks. And again, they're going to need to be flush with the cylinder head surface, and the weight is going to be facing down. Now, I happen to get lucky. I put the cam in the right spot, but if you didn't, what you're going to want to do is remove this wire from the chain, and then you can move this 1 tooth at a time. So I'm just going to pull up on the sprocket, and then say if you need to rock that back, you know, you can rock your timing marks wherever you need them, but I'll put this back where it was supposed to be. Next thing I'm going to do is install the camshaft on the intake side. So to do that, this has a white dot on ours. There's an O around that white dot. That's going to be facing out, and then we have the 2 marks. So the dot's going to end up in this area. So those cam lobes are facing towards the back of the bike, and we'll just line up the sprocket bolt with the cam, and we're going to temporarily install this upper cam sprocket bolt. Then we're just going to temporarily tighten that down. Now we're going to remove the stopper bolt. We'll verify our timing and then install the cam cap. We're going to make sure our dowel pins are in their place, as well as this new O-ring with some oil on it. Now, as the cap goes on, make sure you have your dowel pins lined up and those locating guides for the camshafts. If you need to move the camshaft back and forth to get it to line up, then go ahead and do that. This might be a tight fit, so you want to try to put it on hand. You might have to tap it just a little bit with a mallet, but if you do that, be really careful. You don't want to break anything. Next, we'll apply some lube to the threads of the bolts and install them all in the correct spots. So these shorter ones are going to be towards the cam chain in the middle, and then these longer ones are going to be towards the front and the back. And then we're going to be using the 2 new crush washers on these 2 in the middle. Now we're going to torque these bolts down in a crisscross pattern. So everything except this locating bolt is going to be torqued down to 10 foot-pounds, and we'll just work across here in a couple of steps, and then last we'll torque this bolt down to 7 foot-pounds. Next thing we want to do is remove our old timing chain gasket. Then you'll install the new tensioner gasket. And this surface, if anything was left behind, make sure you wipe it down. And if you need to, use a gasket scraper to get it cleaned up. Then this tensioner, how it works. If I take a flat blade screwdriver and put it in the back and turn this clockwise, it's going to pull the tensioner in. And if I let it go, it's going to let the tensioner spring back all the way out. If it does do that, we'll go ahead and get this exhaust clamp out of the way. Then we'll set the tensioner in place with this middle hump facing inward. Then you want to wind the tensioner plunger so it's all the way in, and then you can rock this into place and install the mounting bolts by hand. Now, you want to verify that the tensioner plunger is all the way in before you tighten the bolts down. We're also using needle nose vice grips to hold on to this screwdriver to keep it from rotating. Once the bolts are tightened, I like to wind the plunger in 1 more time and then release it by removing the screwdriver, and that way I make sure I'm not putting too much tension on the chain. And you also want to install that bolt on the end of the tensioner. Once you've done that, you can reinstall the exhaust clamp. Next, we need to rotate the engine over 360 degrees. Now, it doesn't have to be exact, we just need this weight on the exhaust facing up, and then that exposes that other cam sprocket bolt for the intake. We'll apply some Loctite to that bolt and we'll torque it down to 15 foot-pounds. Now we'll rotate the engine another 360 degrees. We're going to remove this top bolt that we temporarily installed. We'll apply Loctite to it and torque it down to 15 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to double check our timing marks. You want to make sure everything's in the correct position. So our cam sprockets, all of these lines are lined up with the cylinder head surface. That's perfect. The dot is in the right spot. And the line on our flywheel is lined up with the indicator mark on the flywheel cover. So we're ready to install this top cam chain guide. So if you noticed any oil that was leaking from this valve cover, at this point you want to replace whatever gasket it is, whether it's these two the bolts go through or this main valve cover gasket. Now one thing, sometimes people can get a little bit of leakage around the corner, and to prevent that we're just going to apply a little bit of silicone to those corners. It doesn't take a whole lot. And then we'll install the valve cover. Now we can tighten down the valve cover bolts and install the spark plug. And now would be a good time to install a new spark plug as well. Then we can install our breather hose. Next, we'll install the ignition coil. And you want to make sure the cap is snapped down all the way. If it's hard to snap down, you can spray a little bit of silicone spray down on it before you put it in. And then when you hook up the primary leads, the longer lead is going to connect to the bottom of the coil, and the shorter one to the top or the green post. At this point, we need to put the timing covers on the left side of the engine. We'll reinstall the gas tank, our radiator shrouds, and then reconnect the negative terminal on our battery. And then we can install the seat. That's all there is to adjusting the valves on your CRF250R and RX with the twin cams. If you need any parts for your bike, be sure to get those on our website and subscribe to our channel for more helpful content. Thanks for watching.